And so this is important as part of our ongoing efforts to really think about history and place and our role in it. So Bowling Green State University, both our campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts towards decolonizing history, and we honor the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land since time immemorial. Um, Part of ICS's mission is to engage the BGSU campus and surrounding communities through our events and programming. So with tonight's discussion, we hope to help enrich the conversation around how we teach history, particularly of the issues of race and racism in the nation. So I want to thank and introduce Stevie Sharrick to you. Stevie is a graduate student in American Cultural Studies, actually a PhD candidate now. And this event was really their brainchild. So all credit to Stevie for conceiving of the event and really doing the lion's share of planning it. And so with that, I'll let Stevie introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Jolie, and thank you so much to everyone who's here. I'm so glad everyone's joining us for this conversation. And I'll just jump right into the introductions of our wonderful guests. Really honored to be introducing Dr. Nicole Jackson, Dr. Timothy Messer-Kruse, and Gloria Wu tonight. Dr. Nicole Jackson is an Associate Professor of History here at BGSU and former ICS Faculty Fellow. Her work explores the complexity and multiplicity of Black experiences in different historical and contemporary contexts. She is interested in the everyday experiences of Black people and their work to expand the boundaries of social and political citizenship, as well as the intersection between historical reality and popular culture representations of history. She's a regular contributor to Black Perspectives, the blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. We're also joined by Dr. Timothy Messer-Kruse, Professor of Ethnic Studies here at BGSU, and his research explores racial power dynamics at key moments in US labor history. He has published books on the Haymarket Affair, banking history, and race relations in the United States. He has also published numerous articles analyzing the debates sparked by the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission. And we are also joined by Gloria Wu, who teaches social studies at Basher High School and Toledo Public Schools. She has taught for 20 years, primarily AP American Government, and she earned her bachelor's degree in education from Bowling Green State University. So we have a Falcon joining us. And her master's from the University of Toledo. Her involvement in social studies, advocacy, and curriculum development includes serving as a representative of the C3 Framework Teacher Collaborative Council on the Ohio Council for the Social Studies and for the Ohio Department Regional Network. And just a quick note on how to participate in tonight's conversation as we kind of go along, and then I'll turn it over to Jolie. So to participate in tonight's conversation, we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the chat. If you have a question that you would like our guests to address, we ask that you please use the chat function to pose questions to the chat moderator, so that'd be Carrie or I. We will draw those questions from those questions for the Q&A session that'll be happening near the end of the discussion. And we'll also be posting some questions for you to respond to in the chat if you feel inspired to do so. It's not required. And we'll also have a few polls just to kind of gauge where we all were in our own history education. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Jolie. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And just a quick note, depending on what your settings are, I'm not quite sure how you'll be seeing things. So if you do want to toggle, if you don't want to see like everyone all at once, just know if you go up to that top right corner to view and select speaker view, whoever's talking at that time will appear larger, which may be easier on your eyes than seeing dozens of tiny, tiny little boxes. So with that, thank you all so much. I've got a question that I'll start with for Nicole, Tim, and Gloria. And that is a kind of more of a personal question, which is, can you tell us about the history of the United States that you were taught in your K-12 education? And what were some of those main narratives that surrounded the enslavement of Africans and the colonization of indigenous lands and culture? So sort of start with that and then feel free to transition into how do you teach that history today? And how did your understanding of that history evolve? Nicole, would you kick off that question for us?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, Nicole, so the first question is, what was the version of the history of the US that you learned in your K-12 education? What were some of those major narratives, and how do you teach that history today?
So I don't actually have like a very clear understanding of my own education, partially because I'm from California. And so the sort of general framework of like a lot of California history is California history. There is a national sort of standard, of course, but for whatever reason, that's what's stuck. I do remember, though, not liking history until college, where the sort of narrative then at that point was the traditional history narrative that is east to west, England focused, and sort of thinking about, in particular, the Northeast, thinking about that sort of narrative, and entirely very much centered on white, although my first sort of push into history as an undergraduate was by an African Americanist. So I had a very clear understanding of how to center African Americans in US history because she did. And to a certain extent, I do follow her general model, which is to center not just people of African descent, but the really complicated and complex and diverse narrative of American history, so that it is not only east to west, it's also west to east, or sort of north to south, but that also sort of not necessarily the melting pot theory, certainly, but the idea that various groups contribute to even an exclusion, the narrative or the version of the country that we have ended up with today.
Thank you. What about you, Tim? What was your sort of early history education like, and how perhaps is your teaching of that history similar or different today?
Just a moment ago, I turned off my camera so I could reach across my bookshelf where I actually have my fifth grade civics textbook, which I've saved all these years. But I couldn't quite reach it. I'm tethered in here, so I can't really quote from it. But you get the idea. This would have been 1972, 19 something like that. And it was an interesting period looking back on it because it was the immediate post-civil rights period. So the textbooks, no longer as they had in the 50s and before, simply written people and communities of color out of history. They now included some discussion of communities of color and people of color, but they always did so with what I term sort of this missionary sort of guise, this sort of all people of color are just sad victims that we should all mourn for, and they haven't really done anything except to be victimized. And that's kind of the lessons that I received in my public education growing up. And it wasn't until college that I encountered any narrative whatsoever that anybody except white people and great white men had any agency in this country and had any role in building it. So my process of education, like I think many of us, has been a process of uneducation and re-education. Um, and in my own teaching, I can't, it's a little, I find it difficult in some ways because uh, it's almost easier in some ways to teach against a very obviously mistaken narrative, right? So there was a generation of students when I first began teaching. It was in some ways easier to teach because I could just simply say, everything you've been taught is wrong. and let's just start there. But you know, I mean, the students coming to us today, they have you know, they've come from an educational system where there is more sophistication. I think there's more understanding of some of the uh, deeper ideas of history. You know, not ideal, but I find a lot of students come pretty well prepared to our classrooms, at least in terms of a better knowledge, of a more balanced knowledge of the role of race and class in America. So I can't just simply take the position. I'm going to correct everything you know. Instead, it's sort of a new position that I've trying to stake out. Let me tell you some of the things that I've discovered. Let me tell you some other things that I find interesting. Let me tell you some other things that might deepen what you already know. So that's one big change that I think I've perceived over my teaching career is that some of these lessons and ideas that we have been working with in the past 20 years, they have become part of the secondary education curriculum in many places, which is great.
How about for you, Gloria? What you know, what are the differences between the history you had as a student and what you are providing now? How you think about that history as a high school teacher?
I'm really excited to be here. Just a little bit of background for myself. So my father is also a teacher, or was a teacher. He taught 30 years in Toledo Public, where I teach as well. He is also a education graduate of Bowling Green State University. So I'm a second generation of BGSU as well as a teacher. He taught math and I teach social studies. I've taught my whole career in urban education. So I went to high school at Notre Dame Academy, if anyone's familiar, in Ohio, all girl white. I did my student teaching at a Toledo Christian, which is, you know, obviously, and then I've taught my whole career in urban education. My building is about 64% minority and 58% economically disadvantaged. And I've taught world history and mostly AP government. So when I look at, you know, how I've been taught world history, as well as I have taught world history, it's mostly from the European perspective. It is our duty, because the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain, to conquer nationalism, empire building. We're going to save, hop around the world and save the indigenous population. We're going to introduce medicine and education and sanitation. We're going to harvest, invade and harvest, coal and for markets, etc. And of course, the negatives would be, the people who were conquered. I have my grandfather was jailed in the Cultural Revolution in China. I still have relatives in Hong Kong. Many of them are pastors for whatever reason, but the idea of being invaded, losing their native language, or being forced to adapt to English. What else? Racism. I don't know if many people know, like in Asia, it's bad to look tan. You have skin whitening cream, things of that sort. And the question is, how do I approach race and racism in my classroom? Because I teach government, I haven't taught world history in a very, very long time. But I always start with the Constitution and how we got rid of a king that was a monarch, and the king made the rules, changed the rules, enforced the rules. And now, with the progression of time, we are more inclusive. So now, at one point, only white men age 21 on property could vote. And now we've gotten rid of the poll tax. Now we've included gender. Now we've included, young people. In Ohio, if you're age 17 and you turn 18 by the general election, you can vote in a primary. So we are slowly more inclusive. So I usually start with the Constitution, and therefore students feel like there is a way, there is a pathway to success. Sometimes we fall behind, but eventually we are progressing in a more positive light.
So one of the sort of conversation topics, or the impetus for tonight's conversation, is the kind of renewed attention to the teaching of history. And I think about, until, I am embarrassed to say, really until graduate school, my understanding of what history as a discipline was I thought it was the memorization of facts, right? And I thought nothing could be duller. And that was the last thing I would ever want to study, because I did not understand, right? I hadn't really been taught to think of it as debates, as arguments, as interpretations of the historical record. And we have, in these last few years, like these very high profile conversations around the interpretation of history. And those two of those are the 1619 Project, right? Nicole Hannah-Jones for, kind of spearheading that project for the New York Times. And then the response to that coming from President Trump's 1776 commission. So could we first sort of lay out kind of what each of those is? Anyone want to jump in and sort of explain what the 1619 Project was, and then kind of by comparison, the 1776 Project, and what these two different interpretations of history reveal about the moment we're in? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll take a stab at characterizing the 1619 Project. So the 1619 Project's genesis was in 2019, when the 400th anniversary of the first arrival of enslaved people in Virginia was should have been commemorated, but actually was much passed over. There was an official Virginia commemoration, but it was rather small. It was actually eclipsed in some ways by a parallel commemoration that happened the same year, which was the 400th anniversary of the founding of the House of Burgesses, which some scholars and historians claimed as the birth of American democracy. And so you had these two commemorations happening in parallel, one celebrating supposedly the birth of democracy in America, the other commemorating the arrival and the inauguration of what would be perhaps the most oppressive institution.
Tim, I think we have temporarily lost you. So until we, oh,
Equal
you're
civil
back.
rights.
Okay.
Did I drop out for a minute? Sorry.
Yeah, momentarily.
Yeah, it says my internet connection is unstable, so I'm sorry about that. I'll talk to AT&T sometime. But so the whole theory behind the 1619 Project, as it was presented in the New York Times, was that whatever we want to claim as American progress, as Gloria, I think, very well laid out a moment ago, this story of American progress, whether it's a progress in civil rights, or whether it's the progress in defeating slavery, whether it's the inclusion of women, whether it's the rise of the labor movement, all of these various narratives of progress are narratives of struggle. They're not just simply the passage of time. They're not simply rights that are bestowed by the powerful upon the weak. No, in fact, the story of America is the story of groups of people who have been denied inclusion, denied rights, denied privileges, struggling, fighting, dying for those privileges, and eventually attaining them. And the New York Times, I think, in these essays, rightly points out that one of the very most important and powerful groups in forming American society as we like to think of it now, whether we're looking at political, economic, or whatever, are African Americans, because in many ways they had some unbelievably powerful institutions to struggle against. First, slavery for several centuries, and then Jim Crow, and then various neo-Jim Crows that we've had since. And we can connect the dots. We can say that what we understand to be equal rights in this country, what we understand to be our shared cultural attitude, our consensus about freedom and liberty, these are derived primarily from the struggle of people of color and communities of color. That's the argument. That's the fundamental argument. Now, along the way, they also make some other observations based upon newer historical scholarship, such as that the American Revolution has been extremely misunderstood as this sort of contagion of liberty that somehow the American Revolution sparked all of this freedom and equality that we now claim to be part of our society. But in fact, really, the American Revolution was a counter-revolution. It really was an attempt to repress people who were gaining more rights. And in many ways, the American Revolution was an attempt to preserve slavery from threats against it, namely threats within the British Empire. And this is what really, I think, inflamed a lot of conservative and mainstream scholars and wonks and educators to sully the reputation of America's founders in this way. And America.
I think we've temporarily lost Tim again, but that's sort of, I think he's getting to kind of then what the backlash to, right, that 1619 project was, which we saw kind of apotheosized by that 1776 commission. So Gloria or Nicole, either of you want to kind of
You can't write history of America this way. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. We temporarily lost you again. Sorry about that. So Gloria or Nicole, either of you want to attempt to kind of characterize sort of what the 1776 commission, how it positioned itself as a counter narrative to that 1619 project?
I will let Nicole or Tim answer that because they were probably more well versed in that area.
Nicole, do you want to?
I have no desire to deal with that nonsense. No.
Okay, fair enough.
Welcome to.
All right, Tim, will you briefly sort of explain what that was and how that is related to the 1619 project?
You're talking about the 1776 commission and so forth. Well, these are reactions against the 1619 project. They're just knee-jerk reactions, basically. They don't have a lot of academic integrity, frankly. They have a lot of political juice behind them because they cohere with our very conservative political moment, various groups in our society that really want to, reorient education against critical thinking. They want to return education to what they see as a traditional form of education, which I think, Jolie, is exactly what you were talking about before. History is the rote memorization of facts and names. I think they'd be very happy and comfortable with that. They feel very threatened by any narrative that places progress in the hands of struggle and in the hands of communities of color. They're very uncomfortable with narratives that they see as narratives of victimization. That's how they refer to it, and they intentionally fail to see that these histories are not just trying to victimize people again or call them victims, as was the case in the school books that I grew up with in the immediate post-Civil War, civil rights period. I'm not that old. Civil rights period, but you know. Struggle is the whole nature of historical change, and you're just not a very good historian if you deny the force of struggle and the force of people organizing and sacrificing to make change, to explain that change. So if you read the 1776 Commission, it's very clear. It's just an appeal to sort of the traditional rhapsodic history of America. I was able to print it before the Biden administration came and took it down on day one, so I have a copy. But for example, the 1776 Commission says that no nation before America ever dared state these truths as the formal basis for its politics, the truths of equality, so forth. None has strived harder, done more, to achieve more than the United States of America. I mean, this is just empty rhapsody, positivist, Whiggish history. And it's infuriating to me that it's even gotten the traction that it has. But the reason it does is, of course, because it's well funded and it coheres with the conservative politics of one of our major parties currently.
Nicole, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think these recent, both either of these, projects reveal about history as a discipline in our current moment. And really, you don't have to give them equal weight, but sort of, if it's the 1619 project, what is changing perhaps in history and historiography that is being brought into the wider public through some of these projects?
I think in answer to both, it's that most people don't realize what historians do, or they are not current with historiography. So a lot of the initial backlash to the 1619 project engaged that sort of initial backlash to its claims were, I think, kind of confusing to, for instance, African-American historians, because this is literally African-American history. This is what we do, right? There is no, and I am not a US historian, I'm an African-American and African diaspora historian. So the story for me, doesn't really start with 1619, but this is a pivotal moment, obviously, in the narrative of African-American history, and this has been the narrative for decades. So the idea that this was new content that now should be, I don't know, like it was publicized, was a confusing moment. And then in particular, I saw African-American historians saying that their sort of quibbles with the 1619 project were different, because this is a specific narrative of African-American history that also has its own faults, right? That there are sort of narratives here, for instance, in the way in which it displaces the impact of Indigenous people, right? Or the ways in which like that sort of nation building happens on the backs of and on the subjugation of Indigenous people, right? Or that this sort of idea of what we mean to be an American is also based, for instance, on the exclusion of Indigenous people, right? So those are sort of different. So on the one hand, I think having the 1619 project is interesting. It was not revolutionary for me. So I think that is a methodological distinction. And then I think, so I would say for both, they're sort of out of step and certainly behind the actual historiographical conversations that have been happening with historians. And I think some of that is because most historians tend to write insularly, like we write to one another. And then to another extent, we tend not to, this is changing certainly, but we tend not to sort of write to an audience that is directly impacted by the histories that we're telling. That is, again, that also depends on discipline and what you're studying, but I think broadly speaking, there is this sort of problem with historians in that way. So I would say that was my general sort of response, which I actually think I told you that when the 1619 project came out, that it is just, it's not as if it didn't sort of affect me, but it was literally, 15, 20 years behind. The 1619 project, the 1776 project is at least 50 years behind, or something.
Maybe several hundred, yeah, depending. Right. Yeah. Gloria, anything you would want to add about kind of how this moment has, is showing up in the way you're teaching and the, what you're hearing students responding to in a high school classroom?
I want to hop on what Tim had mentioned about about like the narrative of the 1776 commission, and the idea, like I was reading up about it because obviously Nicole and Tim are more well versed in this area. Again, I teach government, but the idea of like patriotism and I think the 1776 commission was labeled as patriotism education. And what I know, like for high school, like the question is, what should we be teaching students? I mostly teach like to the standards. I wish I could teach more historical thinking and critical thinking, but because I deal with minors and I'm tied to a test, I really, unless it's tied to a test, I'm really not encouraged. I do have had parents who have accused me of being too liberal, so I need to show both sides. I try to include more different perspectives, but it's very tricky because I do get pushback from parents. And what are you teaching my child? How are you teaching my child? What is the result? So unfortunately for me, I have to tie it to a specific standard, and it's all test driven.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is, one of the things that is, I certainly think there are lots of conversations we have in the university about kind of the challenges of that transition from K-12 to universities because of our emphasis on testing. And that really leads me to my next question, which is how we think about history. And that, as I mentioned, right, we're sort of often, it's presented as though it's purely objective fact. And so that any changes to the narrative must be politically motivated and are not a matter of interpretation, new evidence, things like that. So, do each of you have particular thoughts about objectivity in history and the ways that that those narratives have shifted over time? I know that's very broad, but I'll leave it there and sort of let folks sort of add to that how they want to or respond to it.
Yeah, I don't believe in objectivity. I don't think that's realistic. And I tell my students that they know that that's how I feel. I think it is a fallacy to imagine that we don't bring ourselves into our work. That is just impossible, right? That we don't bring ourselves into our interpretation of historical events. That is impossible. I think historians and students of history can try to be honest about the biases that they bring to their work, and they can be sort of attempt to be transparent about how that might shape their interpretation. But that is sort of one part of the question. The other part of the question is that historians arrive at accepted knowledge, or what can pass as accepted knowledge, through conversation. And so part of what we see when the historical narrative changes, especially at the scholarly level, right, which is not always evident at the level of K through 12 education or in textbooks, that is actually not always clear, right? Things that are historically accepted by academic historians are not always in textbooks, and that is a reality, right? But when historians arrive at accepted knowledge, we do so through an examination and a examination and a re-examination of all available evidence. And as more evidence becomes available, or as we understand more about how societies work, or as even historians dare to ask different questions, we arrive at new understandings of history. And it is really actually frustrating to see people take what is, I think, a really, well, I'm going to say this and then also with a caveat, what is, I think, a really egalitarian field of study. Like, we are all able to contribute to that based on our own biases, our own training, our different questions, right? That is an egalitarian field that the minute it hits the political sphere becomes nothing but propaganda. All of that conversation is gone. And yet that is the interpretation that becomes somehow objective, and it is anything but.
Tim or Gloria? Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I was gonna add. I agree very wholeheartedly with everything Dr. Jackson pointed out. I think that's all really, really true. I mean, the sad thing is that only those of us who have a critical position on American history are concerned with things like objectivity. I mean, those who are pushing for what they call patriotic, quote, authentic, quote, wholesome education have absolutely no interest in objectivity or interest in accuracy. Their agenda is simply indoctrination. Um, and you know, the really dangerous thing is that if we strive for objectivity, we have to begin from the position that we can't choose heroes and villains in this arrangement. The minute you start seeking out your heroes, you've already departed from objectivity as a scholar and as a historian. I mean, our obligation, I think, to be as clear-eyed as we can be is to set aside as much as we can, and we never can do it completely, but is set aside as much as we can of our own identities, our own values, our own positionality, our own place in the world, and try and see things not only in the way that people in the past saw them, but try and see them as clearly as possible without seeking out, you know, comforting stories. Uh, you know, the whole prospect of seeing history as patriotic, you know, destroys history itself from the very beginning. So the very premise of this 1776 approach is flawed. It's simply an appeal to you know, impose on Americans something like Gloria, your grandfather suffered in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In this case, you know, it would be having to wear a tri-cornered hat and talk about all the great white men in buckle shoes. Um, and that's where, you know, I think that those forces want to take us.
I'm going to chime in on what Nicole and Tim said. You know, I don't know where the idea that teachers get the idea that teachers have a liberal agenda. I wish that in social studies, standards, it's not, for me, I feel like this is the standard, this is what you need to know, this is what you're tested. Why can't we do more C3 oriented things, college and career civic life, to question, problem solving, allow students to think for themselves, try to come to conclusion to help elevate society and to bring society more as a whole. And I agree, I think it's, you know, when I grew up, we learned, we said the Pledge of Allegiance. Why don't you guys say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore in class? Why don't you know, simple facts and that's it? Why do you need to question and ask why? And I think you should ask question, ask why, and how can we become a better society, a better country?
I want to, next question, and it is to really talk about, we've alluded to this, history curricula and textbooks, right? Sort of um, how those narratives especially in K-12 are shaped. And Gloria, you know, as an educator, can you talk a little bit about the process, about how much say you have in the curricula that you can use and the voices and perspectives you have space for, and what we should understand about what goes into those curricula and textbook and what gets approved, and how those things are produced. And you've alluded to this, but maybe a bit more also about the role of parents and students in kind of responding to some of that.
I have very little say. I mean, to be honest, I have very little say. I'm very standards based. The Ohio Department of Education creates the standards. Again, I teach government, so I know at the end of every semester, we have a test. This has been very, very difficult for me this year because we've been remote since March. We just went, so that means I had to learn completely teaching online. This is the first year ever, urban school, we've ever had one-to-one. So learning to teach and Wi-Fi issues. We just went hybrid in February, and we're going back to, so that's half. I only saw my students twice a week in person and the rest online. And then next week we're going full-time, to school, or to 100%, 1,300 of my students. I'll be seeing them every day. So we usually have a textbook committee that will select textbooks, but our textbooks are dated as of now. I use I'm on the end of course exam committee for the American government testing. So there's tons of different, like, range finding, content standards creation committees that I help well, I'm on the range finding one to help assess what questions to be on the test. So again, very little, again, tied to the standards. I try my best to be diverse. I try to put as many resources as possible. I know for my students, they have difficulty reading, writing. They don't always have the best family life. So I know that, it was very, very difficult for the pandemic. I know my students don't always will put their best forward for them, but they'll do it for me. So again, I'm extremely happy that I'm in school. They'll work for me. They'll fight for me. Moving forward, and again, my mind is my mind was all jumbled. What is the number one question you want to ask me before I hand the baton? What is the regarding parents, just engaging, providing resources, just to be an advocate.
Thank you, Gloria. I think that covers a lot of ground. Nicole or Tim, do you want to sort of talk about how those textbook debates look different in the college classroom? And I'm thinking particularly when you're teaching the sort of general education histories, right? So students who that may be their first college level history. What are you seeing in that, the sort of way that they've been taught history, given these limitations and the way states dictate standards, with kind of the shift in priority that you may have in wanting them to be introduced to kind of college level approaches to history? And whether that touches on textbooks or, not using textbooks, I'd be really curious.
I use a textbook, and I probably always will for a few different reasons. I would generally agree with what Tim said at the opening. I think that students have a very clear understanding about the broad outlines of American history, partially because we do still teach, most states still teach that sort of memorization. So they are able to remember dates, they're able to remember those quote unquote important names. I mean, they understand like great man history. So they're really interested in like wars and presidents and whatever, things like that. I'm not particularly fascinated by those things. And so I take for granted that they know those. And then the textbook provides them a much more, so I use Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty Volume 2. And there are other textbooks, certainly, but part of the reason I continue to use that one is, one, it's updated. I think he updates it honestly too much, but every like couple of years or something like that. Like I think in the earliest version now, he deals with the beginning of the Trump presidency. I think he has gone back. So there is, and he doesn't change much content, but he does do some sort of light revision if like his interpretation has changed as he adds new material, which I think is interesting. But I also think part of the reason I use that textbook is because it is one of the few in US history that is committed to as broad of an understanding of Americans as possible. So that includes Indigenous people, even when they are not legally citizens. That includes immigrants from various countries, not just European countries. That includes African Americans, but also, this could be a little bit better, but also people who are immigrating from the Caribbean. That includes a sort of dedicated focus to looking at women's history, to integrating the experiences of Jewish Americans and Eastern Europeans. I mean, there's just such a broad focus on like Americans that it does really fit this sort of narrative that is easier for me to build on. And that is hard to find. It also means that that book is expensive, and it means that that book is a lot, I guess is the easiest way to say. So for my students, it is a lot of information. But the idea for me at the very least is that he's also committed to sort of telling that particular narrative of American history, not just through the eyes of white European political stakeholders. So when he's talking about the removal of Indigenous people from their lands, he's telling that story through Indigenous sources, right? When he's talking about Reconstruction, which is one of his areas of expertise, he's telling that story, for instance, through former Confederates, also former Union soldiers, as well as freed people, right? And those who were free before the war, as to sort of make clear that this is not a North and South, right? Or simply a Black and white context. There are many stakeholders there. So I guess that is a sort of easy way of explaining why I use the textbook. But I also sort of build on that with other sources as well, because still nothing can be complete.
Tim, you've created textbooks of your own. So do you want to add anything here about kind of what goes into your thinking about using or creating a textbook in the college classroom?
Well, my struggle was a little bit different because I haven't taught history in a long time. Frankly, I teach ethnic studies. I always teach a section of introduction to ethnic studies every semester, and the struggle I had in finding curricular materials for that class is different than the one that I think historians have teaching Introduction to U.S. History 1 or 2, and that difficulty that I had was twofold. One, and I know this isn't a discussion of ethnic studies, but one is that many of the more popular books in that field are organized around sort of the identity group of the week sort of model. And that's not the way that I teach the class. I teach the class in a much more integrated horizontal manner where I try and talk about the continuity of struggles and things like that. And breaking it up by groups also alienates each group's story from everybody else, right? So I didn't like that approach. That's one problem. And the other problem is that some of the very best textbooks are actually collections of articles, academic articles. They're readers essentially in ethnic studies. And that students find that very difficult because every article has a different voice, has a different approach. Some are heavily jargon rich and not accessible. And so, and I'm generally very anti unnecessary jargon. So I have a, kind of a visceral reaction when, sentences that run on for 12 or 14 dependent and independent clauses. And that's why I pretty much developed my own materials. But that's a different struggle than in history. I think in history we have, a different problem, and that's how do we integrate and fit everything in? Because it's just an overwhelming amount of material if you really want to give it its due, right? And one of my old mentors back at Wisconsin, he also wrote a couple textbooks, and I asked him what the biggest challenge in writing his textbooks were. And he said, well, a textbook is like a city bus. When it's full, if someone gets on, someone has to get off. And that's kind of the problem, right? It's like, who gets off, who gets on, what's important, what's not. And we don't always agree with the choices others make about who gets on and who doesn't.
This is maybe a strange segue, but I think that idea of, that syllabi, textbooks, you're forced to make choices, and those choices have implications, right? I wonder if we could maybe sort of shift next to what is the significance of, what is the way we teach American history? What impact does it have on Black, Indigenous, and students of color, right? The way we're currently teaching it, or if we do teach it in ways that don't simply reproduce this nostalgia for kind of, the founding fathers. Why does it matter? And how does it matter to shift the approach to history, especially around issues of race and racism and identity?
I will start. I know my students are tired about learning about slavery because they feel oppressed. They would feel like, why do we always have to talk about slavery? Why can't we talk about Barack Obama or what have you? Black History Month is so short, but we know that the test is, and of course exam is around the corner, so we can't establish a lot of time. So my answer, again, talking about progress and again, a pathway to success, right? So yes, minorities of many sorts, many backgrounds have been oppressed. But what are some avenues to success? Voting, you're talking about civic engagement, if you want to run for office. We have federalism, we have many levels of government. If you want to campaign, I make my students do campaign hours. My inner city school students. So I've had students work for Trump. I've had, you know, one of my Muslims and Hispanic students were at the rally last year. I have students, you know, whether it's levy, campaigning. If you want to contribute, if you want to do a blog or what have you, but what are the avenues to progress? So there is a way. So even though we have to acknowledge history, we have to learn from history, but there is a pathway to democracy. And I try to instill and empower students. And I got 5 kids that passed the AP test last year. So I was really excited about that.
Nicole or Tim, either of you want to take up sort of, you know, how, maybe not just why it matters, I think we know why, but sort of how it matters to students to have these kind of, you know, less white Eurocentric versions of history, not versions, but Eurocentric histories that are beginning to be taught more frequently.
I would say, so there are a few ways for me to answer that question. I don't actually know another way. It's not as if I had to learn this. I'm African American. I learned African American history at home, right? This is how I entered into an understanding of American history. I was lucky enough that the first person to teach me American history in college was a white woman who was trained in African American history. She centered Black people and other people of color from the beginning. This is literally the only way I understand this history, and it is the only way I will teach it. On the other hand, I teach African American history sparingly here at BG, and this is what I study, and I regularly have to give lectures showing graphic images of lynchings, graphic images of bodily mutilation, right? I have to give lectures that center the pain of people who look like me, right? And I have to do so to who look like me or who don't look like we imagine quote unquote Americans look. And I have to do so while students in my classroom cry. Like I've had students cry in my classroom because of that. I've given job talks where people have cried, right? Because so much of what I study is literally painful. There's no other way to teach the history of this country and avoid that. And if I were asked to, I wouldn't. So I would say that's another way to answer this question. But I think the other part of that is also watching the students' face light up because they know something, right? This is the thing they learned at home. Like I learned things at home about American history, right? Or a student I had a few years ago whose mother was Mexican American and had told her all of this stuff about like the Bracero program that she had learned from her own family. Like she was ecstatic to talk about that in class. She felt like I understand this thing better than other people. And that mattered to her. And now she's in an MA program in history, right? Like there is this way in which we have lost potential historians, potential archivists, potential museum curators, because we refuse to acknowledge that the history in this country is not old white men in powdered wigs or whatever, like, or we do not all trace our ancestry back to Western Europe, right? We are not all immigrants, right? The sort of narratives that we have and that we continue to perpetuate about American history, we are losing, right? So much about our own history because we refuse to acknowledge that it is much less neat as we would maybe like it to be. But there is such a richness there as well. American history, like learning it literally, and in a lot of ways teaching it has helped me understand much more about, for instance, my grandparents who moved to California right after the end of World War II, right? That California history that I learned in high school and middle school that stuck with me, but also didn't include anyone who looked like me, never told me that my family ended up there for very particular economic reasons. And they moved with thousands of other people from the states that my family's from to take advantage of that. And it gave me this like rich understanding of my own history. And I tell my students that, right? That we're dealing with a part of American history that literally hits at my own personal history, I tell them that. And that allows them to do the same if they feel comfortable with me. I mean, history can be a really beautiful thing to study and share. And yet we continually strip it down to this autocratic and boring like sort of process of memorization that are all the reasons I hated it when I was a kid. Or, you know, so I just think that there's value in teaching it in ways that is more inclusive, but to do so, you cannot hide from all of the ugly that lives in there as well.
Jim, anything you want to add about, you know, why and how teaching history centered on people of color kind of matters to students?
Well, it matters in a number of ways. I mean, in my own teaching, I have many other types of goals than relaying the landmarks of American history. I think one of my chief goals, given the demographic makeup of most of the students at BGSU, uh, is getting students comfortable and familiar with talking about issues of race and class and gender, and being curious about those things, because so many students, especially coming from rural Ohio, white rural Ohio, they grow up feeling that these are taboo subjects, that it's impolite to talk about them, that you'll offend someone just by being curious about these subjects. And we have to model and we have to teach students how to be curious and how to think for themselves, and to talk about these issues which everyone we know thinks about and operates with in their mind, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable elaborating them. So that's one of my chief goals in my teaching, is getting students comfortable being able to talk, and especially being able to think about these subjects, and getting them curious, right? I'm less interested in sort of having a checklist of things that I want them to walk away from the class with, than walking away with a certain set of skills and a certain new enthusiasm for just thinking about and just appreciating the topic, maybe reading the next thing they see. Um, and I think, you know, so much of 21st century teaching going forward is going to be being critical, teaching critical skills of content analysis and media analysis, because I think that's our biggest problem right now that I see is student innumeracy in being able to discriminate and distinguish between good sources and bad sources of information. And that's becoming increasingly more difficult as the proliferation of sources of information continues. And I think that's going to be a bigger and bigger part of my teaching, and probably a lot of people's teaching, is how to actually parse out what are good information sources and what are bad information sources.
I have one last question for the group, and then I think we'll start sort of going through some of the questions in the chat. So if folks do have other questions, please put them there and we'll sort of bundle those thematically. But my last question for all of you is, what would you like people to take away for, like, what can we do to ensure a more complex version of history is told in our K-12 schools and in our universities? What would you recommend to us in our roles as educators, as students, perhaps as parents of students, either now or in the future? What are some things that you would like us to do differently to ensure that we get to tell and learn different narratives of history?
I would say to be inclusive and to include as many voices as possible. I think you sent us a set of questions, and one of the questions is whose voice and whose narrative is heard, and how do you learn about history and rewriting history and acknowledging history? And the more voices, the more perspectives, the more you corroborate history, the more you appreciate and understand it. And I think that's what I would like. That's the takeaway I would suggest.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well. I think that is, generally speaking, a sign of doing good historical work, is sort of really kind of ceding space, right, to many different kinds of voices. And to be really practical, to that end, I love using podcasts. Like there are some really great podcasts that are sort of centering certain parts of like American history that have either not received the kind of popular attention necessary. So for instance, I use one called 9066 on the internment of Japanese Americans that centers the experiences of actual internees. So it tells the story from their perspective as opposed to from the US government down. So it doesn't necessarily begin with Pearl Harbor. But there are also some really great podcasts on like Black Southerners and like Black Southern farmers. There's one coming out soon, I think, on the Tulsa riot, or Tulsa massacre. So there's, I mean, I think in terms of, because also this might be a thing that K through 12 teachers experience. My students want to learn more. They want to hear many different voices, but they literally just do not want to read more. So if I can find a pretty good podcast episode, I will do so. So like the 1619 has a podcast companion. I use a couple of those episodes as well. So for those who are better at audio learning or who are just sick of reading, I incorporate that as well. That's also a great way to literally just incorporate other voices, right? So I don't have to be the voice that is sort of giving them this information, and I'm the only voice they hear, like literally. So I try to do that as well.
I don't have a lot more to add to that. You know, it's an uphill battle no matter what you do. But you know, I think teaching skepticism, you know, telling students don't believe everything I say just because I say it. But you know, I think just we should think of teaching a lot as modeling, right? A lot of it is just when you're enthusiastic, students get the idea, hey, this can be interesting. When you're critical and you express, you show them how to actually work through an idea from start to finish, work through a source, criticize a source. That's modeling a skill. And so I think a lot of what we should do and think about doing is doing as opposed to teaching, right? A lot of it is actually doing in the classroom so students can see what that looks like.
Stevie, do you have a question or a kind of constellation of related questions for the group from the chat?
Yes, the chat was so good that I didn't bother you all with like any questions. You all kind of kept it going. So we had a question from Lauren, and I think we did kind of address it, but her specific question was, would it then be accurate to declare, and this is going back to the 76 Commission, to declare that the 76 Commission is a result of nationalism that seeks to perpetuate a glorification of US history in order to ignore its faults? And then maybe also thinking to what extent, like, has K through 12 US history been a nationalist project to begin with? And maybe is it like preserving that? Just, I'm expanding on our question a little bit, but yeah. I don't know who wants to take that first. I'll also run the poll questions now, so we can look at those while we're getting questions ready. And
well, I can be quick in an answer for that. The answer is yes.
There is oh, please go ahead, Nicole.
Can I also just expand on that? I don't understand how that's controversial. Like most state educational systems are literally like nationalistic on some level. Like the idea of public education is to train good citizens. How do you do that if you train them to be skeptical, right? So like there is some acceptance of the reality that that is the goal. You can argue if that has sort of run amok, and kind of just depends, but the idea that it's sort of based on this nationalist project to sort of imagine the US as the best there ever was. I mean, you could also just look at the history books and sort of see not only that that has been the history of American education, but also when it has run amok as well.
In AP government, we talk about different theories of government, like there's the elitist theory, there's the participatory theory. And really our government is based on a pluralism. So basically bipartisanship. We want all voices heard, and by everybody having a say through consensus building, negotiation, compromise, we will come to a neutral decision. So that's the ideal. That's what the founding fathers projected, and that is something that we sometimes get to and sometimes not. But we want all voices to be heard.
While the poll is running, and then I think we might want to sort of chat briefly about what that poll question and answers reveal. But first, another related question was about how do each of you feel about Black history mandates, right? So, and we're seeing kind of I think that's also related to kind of ethnic studies curriculum in California, things like that. So I'm curious, feelings about that potential for Black history to be mandated, or like in Utah, students can opt out. Anyone want to take that?
I don't know how you would not mandate African American history or Native American history or any of a half dozen other important and formative groups in American society and culture. It's absurd to me that that's even an argument, right? It's absurd that this is even controversial. I mean, I to be perfectly frank, I'm just flummoxed daily by the fact that any of these things are even controversial. I guess that's my ivory tower for speaking there, but I am constantly amazed. I guess I just don't understand. I don't really get it.
One of the first poll that Stevie has put up is about kind of what did the Naturalization Act of 1790 do? And you can see, because everyone's seeing kind of the breakdown of what people voted for. So do one of you want to give us what the correct answer is, and maybe what the distribution of answers reveals about sort of the narratives that proliferate around our history? Gonna leave everyone hanging and make them Google it later?
Well, one answer comes up with a red bar, so I think that's probably the right answer, right? The red bar. No.
The red bar just means the most people.
Oh, that's the most. Okay. It's also the right answer, so the red works both ways.
So very good. So 48% of you were correct.
We should also point out that it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that birthright citizenship was established in America. So the entire first 165 years, 65 years of the nation's 85. My math, see, that's why I'm in ethnic studies. I don't do math. First 4 generations of American history, the birthright citizenship didn't exist. So citizenship was by fiat, by state fiat.
Stevie, do you have another kind of question or constellation to share with the group?
Yes, we had a question from Justin, doing some peer-reviewed research here in the question, talking about Dr. Gerald Horne from the University of Houston, criticizing the 1619 Project for not going far enough for critiquing the US, and sort of it seems like Horne is talking about sort of like Florida being a Spanish colony pre-1619, and talking about how, right, the history of people being Africans, people being brought to the US continent as slaves started even before then. And Justin's asking, is this just a semantics point, or can we even move it further back when we start talking about sort of how this creates the fabric of like US society and history?
Gerald Horne making those criticisms is kind of ironic, because the 1619 Project relied heavily on Gerald Horne. So he was one of the very important contributing scholars to that project. So, I mean, you know, there's plenty of things to quibble with historically with any, you know, essay project like the 1619 project. There's no doubt. I mean, sure, you can even quibble with the 1619 as a starting date. In fact, we actually don't have good historical records as to what the actual status of the, I think it was 14 individuals who were landed that time in Virginia from a Dutch ship. We know the name of the ship. We even know some of the names of the people who were landed. We don't know what their status was. We don't know if it was intergenerational slavery. We don't know if it was indentured servitude for a term of service. We don't know if it was lifetime servitude. We have no idea. And I think one of Horn's point, of course, is that we can't talk about slavery as being all one thing. And we can't talk about it just beginning at one point in time, that there's a multitude of different types of systems that we call slavery, but are dramatically different from each other, with different sorts of boundaries and different sorts of oppressions and different sorts of definitions of personhood. And we need to keep all that in mind. We can't just lump them all in the same basket. I think that's a very, very important point. But the danger, I think, here is that at a moment when it's just a huge pile-on from every conservative in the country claiming that the 1619 project, which is a paragon of critical thinking, is actually indoctrination of American students. I think it behooves us perhaps to hold our ammunition a little bit and you know, let some of these minor things go. Dr. Horn, I'll have to mention that to him next time I talk to him. This is so funny, but okay, that's good.
I'd also say that one of the critique from African Americanists and African diaspora historians in particular is that part of the 1619 project, it does actually rely on a particular narrative of American history that traces everything back to England, right? So if you sort of think about the ways in which the French and Spanish have been just as pivotal in shaping the space of North America, then obviously the histories of slavery are older, right? But they're also much more complicated. So sort of thinking of the ways in which slavery operated, or race even looked, in French and Spanish territories as compared to the way they looked in English territories tells us actually a good deal about, as Tim said, the very complicated nature of what slavery looked like. And also it allows us to think about slavery, how it developed over time, right? So when I and my colleagues teach slavery in the Americas, where we are looking at English spaces, French spaces, Spanish spaces, Dutch spaces, those histories of slavery intersect, and they very often sort of build on one another, but they are like legally even just very different, right? So then those societies are very different. And if we're really thinking about having the fullest understanding of American history, you really do actually have to deal with the ways in which formerly French and Spanish territories do actually look very different on the question of slavery, but also for so many other things to this day, right? Like some of those states, like they retain those same kinds, or some of those same kinds of original distinctions that you don't see in formerly English territories. So that would be part of telling the fullest story.
I have a question for Tim and Nicole. This is my question. My question to you guys is the concept of cancel culture, and to what degree do we, with the drive right now to rename, to rebrand, to what have you, to what extent? And I'll give you myself as an example. I teach at Bowsher High School. And from the very beginning, we are known as the Bowsher Rebels. And we've had the Rebel flag, we've had Dixie. And I was on the mascot selection committee, and we are now the Blue Racers. And there's a lot of backlash regarding that. But I'm like, yeah, we're from South Toledo, but it's in these times, it's a no-go. So I just wondering what your opinion, are we going too far? Are we not going far enough?
I don't care about any of this. I think people are particularly invested in names and legacies, and if they did the history, they'd realize that those things don't go back as far as they imagined. So I don't know if we need to expend all of that energy, but I also just don't understand why people care. Like, if what you really care about is if your team wins, like at the end of a season, then what they're called really doesn't matter. I don't understand all of the hubbub about any of that. Change the name, who cares?
I just think it's deeply ironic that white conservative culture, which has erased the stories of most communities of color for centuries in this country, suddenly finds this new crusade of cancel culture on their part, and they're the ones who have been doing all the silencing for so long. I mean, and I'm constantly amazed, and I tell my students this every semester. I say, Northwest Ohio is a great example of the true cancel culture because we have many very famous people and that deserve memorialization from Northwest Ohio that have not received any memorialization. Let me give you one example. How many of you have heard the name James Ashley? Representative James Ashley. Okay, Representative James Ashley was a House of Representatives member from Toledo. He represented the Toledo district. He is also the author of the 13th Amendment. He wrote the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. And until 2008, when Marcy Kaptur corrected this historical travesty, there was not one school, one street, one fire station named for Mr. Ashley, who made probably one of the most signal contributions to our national history that you could imagine from any person who came out of this area. He was completely erased and canceled, largely because of that vote, by the way, largely because in the wake of the Civil War, in the rush to reunify the North and the South and to find new brotherhood and all that BS, he was written out of the story. That's cancel culture. We're merely correcting what was the cancel culture of the past. Let me point out who is commemorated with one of the two first built high schools in the city. There were two high schools built in 1913. One was Jessup Scott and one was Morrison Waite. Jessup Scott was the editor of the Toledo Blade. Morrison Waite was the Supreme Court justice who undid the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It was Morrison Waite and his court that ruled in Cruikshank versus U.S. in the slaughterhouse cases and the other crucial cases that undid much of the work of the Civil War. That's who we celebrate. So the next time anybody approaches me and says, don't take that statue down, don't take that Confederate flag down, don't stop, why are you criticizing that we sing Dixie at the football games? I'll say, tell me who James Ashley is, and I'll talk to you. And that's how I'll begin the next conversation, because it's ludicrous that anybody makes a case out of the left being cancel culture when American history has been canceled for centuries.
Just to go to the poll result, once again, maybe this is not a representative sample, but well done with students knowing their history about when the Chinese Exclusion Act was actually repealed. It wasn't repealed until 1943. Stevie, do you have another question for us?
Let me find it back in the chat here. Yeah, so Lita is asking a question, especially teaching in our American Culture Studies program, I think cultural pluralism in the United States, and teaching to, I think she's kind of talking about teaching to a mostly white audience. And Lita, you can correct me in the chat if I'm completely misinterpreting the question you were asking, but talking about teaching multiculturalism and like diverse cultures to a mostly white audience without sort of exoticizing or fetishizing, or sort of how do you kind of make sure that you're really representing to students who this might be their only exposure, right? Giving them sort of like the best, most well-rounded picture that you can.
I use feelings a lot. I put pictures or cartoons, and what do you see in the picture? How do you think they feel? What do you think they're saying? And I try to play upon emotion, and then I build the conversation from there.
I think that I don't really have an answer to that, because I think it is trial and error. I think the idea that we won't make mistakes is wishful thinking. I absolutely had students push me on my own interpretation of even things that I'm really sure about, right? I've had students offer, so I guess one, I would sort of give up the idea that you're ever going to do it so perfectly. You won't. You, for the rest of your career, hopefully, you should be reflecting and revising where necessary. I think the other thing too is I invite my students to, in all of my lectures when we're teaching in person, I invite them to have their own interpretation. So my lectures are much more conversation on the best of days. I have definitive ideas. I can direct their analysis, but by no means is my interpretation the only interpretation. So I also give them other either scholarly interpretations or things, or allow for us to sort of build one together. I think what you really want to have is a lot of what Tim was talking about earlier, which is a sort of classroom environment that allows for you not to be the expert per se, right? But for you to be facilitating the development of skills that allow you all to achieve a goal. And if your goal is to have a conversation that is respectful and at times careful, right? Of really sensitive topics, then even if you fall short, you have hopefully made a little bit of progress.
I feel I need to learn more from my colleagues about that one. I appreciate all their comments, and I'm learning that. So that's I don't have anything to add.
Again, I'm delighted by the sense of history that we're seeing. I think maybe there have been some important improvements to how K-12 is teaching some of this history compared to when I was a student. So I think there's one more poll question that we might send out now as a kind of as part of our parting conversation. And I think this gets to that question of sort of where do we go from here? So while people are answering that, Stevie, do you have another question?
I didn't see any in the chat, unless I missed something that just popped up.
Something that I saw earlier in the chat that wasn't a question, but I think is an interesting one, which is the role of our economic system in our educational system, such that public education at the K-12 level is funded according to property taxes, and the role that then politics play in curriculum. So I would be curious to have our panelists respond to kind of what effects they see there, and if there are recommendations or hopes for kind of things people can do that might shift that. So Gloria, do you want to take that first, since you are really the one kind of facing this most directly?
I think if our students are our future and we want to empower them, we need to invest as much as possible. Whether, like for me, it's ideally small class sizes, internet, before and after school programming, mentors, long days for me. I tried the best, but again, if we could just provide more resources, access. So many of my students are from single home families or out of district. The more resources we can give, the more support, the better. More mentors.
Tim or Nicole, any thoughts about kind of our current funding model?
Yeah, I'm not a fan, but I do I do tend to and I'm trying to remember the lesson now, and I honestly can't. But I do actually gosh, I can't remember what it is now, but I used to give my students in my, again, modern US course the opportunity to think about, I give them now lots of opportunity to think about their own education and how it is shaped, what they do and don't know, right? So I do a lot of the class, like, what do you know about, this? And we sort of crowdsource their information. And then later on in the semester, I used to do an activity where I think they had to do a political platform. I honestly don't know. But part of the conversation, I was on sabbatical before all this happened, and that feels like 3 years ago. But part of the conversation, at least for some of my students, as they are sort of developing a political platform, was to think about their own education. And in that sort of moment, a lot of my students realized for the first time that that is how their education was funded, right? Because they don't really understand that that's what it looks like. And then at least, every now and then I will ask students to think about a different way to fund education, if for nothing else, right? So I'm not a fan. I honestly don't know if that will ever change. But I do think that we do a disservice to our students at every level to not be clear about the opportunities they do and do not have, being based on the sort of the structure of funding. And I would also argue that students, poorer students, right, or students in poorer districts tend to know that. And so maybe where the education is necessary isn't quite them, right? So I don't know if that was a useful answer, but more education, that's it.
Well, I would extend that to higher education as well and say that, of course, in the last 25, 30 years, higher education, public higher education has followed that same sort of a funding model in the sense, not of looking at the local tax base, but of drawing more, greater and greater percentage of its revenue from students themselves, our so-called customers. And this funding model, moving away from state support to tuition-driven institutions, has driven the curriculum and has put tremendous pressure on the selection of courses that we do teach, the faculty that we do have, the mix of programs that we have. It's not driven so much by what we think students should know or what we think are important elements of knowledge. It's really driven by what the market seems to determine is saleable. And I don't think that's sustainable in the long term. I think we are engaged in a process of really sort of undermining the foundations of thinking and education itself at every level. And in the elementary and secondary levels, of course, this funding model is going to be extremely difficult to change because it's tied to racial segregation and class segregation. It's the basis for why we still have such vast disparities in the demographics of schools across this country. And until we get some movement that demands more equity in these opportunities, the beneficiaries of exclusion are not going to suddenly open their doors. So yeah, that's a huge problem.
Well, and to add to that, right, when we think about kind of the crisis of crushing student debt and the increasing cost of college, right, we have to understand and recall that that is because of systematic, decades-long disinvestment in higher education, right? Across the country, state by state, and that, public higher education, my father could pay for his whole tuition by working for a summer in, cleaning the inside of industrial oil tanks, right? Nowadays, in order to pay for college, you'd have to earn in the summer the equivalent of like $40,000, that kind of, not an hourly wage, right? And so the reasons that we see such crushing debt now, it isn't merely a matter of, oh, fancy climbing gyms at colleges. It's because of a system, decades-long systematic disinvestment. So I want to thank you all for a fabulous conversation. And thank you to our participants for great questions and comments in the chat. A couple of things. I want to say thank you to Stevie Sharrick and Rhianna Dawson for planning this event and taking care of all of the details to make this event go so smoothly. And I want to thank the other members of the ICS team who've been invaluable behind the scenes: Carrie Hanlon, Morgan Taylor, Autumn Bowman, Ryan Cummings, and Deanna McKeegan. And I have a request of the panelists. If you would share with us, doesn't have to be now in the chat, could be via email, some of your favorite textbooks, books, podcasts, things that you think are doing great work in the teaching of history. We'd love to collect those and then make those available to folks, because I think there's a lot of interest. And I'll say the same thing if there are folks on the chat who have ideas of things that they have read, listened to, watched, or enjoyed. If you could send those to ics@bgsu.edu, we will work to compile those in some fashion and share those out via social media. And if we have your email address from your registration, we can send it out that way as well. So thank you all very, very much.